The world screams, but true wisdom whispers. Amid the deafening chaos of modern existence, where every second is filled with noise, notifications, and relentless expectations, there exists an almost forgotten art. The ability to turn inward, to dive into the deep oceans of one's own being. The origin of inner silence is not a destination but a journey. A journey that begins the moment we decide to observe, without judgment, the landscape within. The young monk walked through the canyons of a remote mountain, each step a meditation, each breath a ritual of connection with the universe. His slow, mindful steps carried centuries of tradition and wisdom, not the wisdom of books, but that which is transmitted through silence, through observation, through a deeper understanding of existence. His journey was not about conquering external mountains, but about scaling the mountains within. Every stone along the path, every gust of wind that passed through him, every distant birdsong were silent masters, teaching lessons deeper than any words could express. The simple robe that covered him was more than just fabric. It was a symbol of detachment, of simplicity. No ornamentation, no ostentation, only the essential. And the essential, he knew, was not in external things, but in the ability to be present, to observe without being lost. In Buddhist tradition, silence is not absence. It is total presence. It is a state of complete awareness where each breath becomes a bridge between the inner and outer worlds. A state where there is no division between observer and observed, where consciousness itself becomes an instrument of understanding. The monk carried with him only a small cloth bag and a rolled-up scroll symbols that the true journey requires little. True knowledge is not accumulated. It is realized. It is not collected. It is experienced. Years of training had taught him that the real journey was not outward, but profoundly inward. Every movement was a meditation, every thought an opportunity for observation, every breath an invitation to presence. The mountain around him was not just a landscape. It was a mirror. Its unmoving rocks reflected the inner stillness necessary for true understanding. Its trees, bending to the wind without resistance, taught the art of accepting without breaking. Silence was not a void to be filled, but a sacred space to be honored. A realm where thoughts drift like clouds, where emotions flow like a river, where consciousness remains like the sky, vast, open, undisturbed. In that precise moment, the monk was not an individual on a mountain. He was the mountain itself. He was the wind. He was the silence. He was pure awareness observing itself in infinite simplicity. The light of dawn began to paint the canyons in gold, heralding the arrival of something new. The traveler did not yet know it, but his life would be transformed by this silent encounter. The traveler approached, carrying more than just his simple bags. He bore an invisible weight, a burden woven from incessant thoughts, worries multiplying like dark clouds, threatening to engulf the sky of his consciousness. His steps were heavy, not from physical exhaustion, but from mental fatigue. Each thought was a stone, each worry a pebble he carried in an imaginary backpack. Anxieties about the past, fears of the future, judgments about himself and others, all piling up, creating a suffocating weight that kept him from truly breathing. The monk observed in silence, like someone watching a turbulent river, not with sentimental pity, nor with cold detachment. He simply witnessed the internal storm of the human being approaching. The traveler's thoughts buzzed like a swarm of bees. Memories of past failures mixed with anxious anticipations of the future. What if I'm not good enough? What if I lose everything? What if I never succeed? Each question was a mental whip, each doubt another weight pressing down on his already overburdened existence. The human mind has this extraordinary ability to create entire worlds that never existed, worlds built from fears, expectations, and comparisons. The traveler was an untiring architect of these ghostly realms, constructing and reconstructing narratives that imprisoned him. The monk knew that this internal noise was the real mountain to be climbed. Not the rocks and cliffs around them, but the rugged landscape of a mind in constant turmoil. A mountain made of thoughts, memories, and projections, just as real as any physical scenery, yet infinitely more challenging to traverse. Each thought of the traveler was like a wave crashing against the rocks of his own awareness, violent, noisy, consuming energy without creating true movement. It was a sea of contradictions, where the same waters that could be a source of life had become an instrument of self-destruction. Zen tradition compares the restless mind to an overflowing cup. As long as it is full of murky water thoughts, judgments, expectations, there is no space to receive anything new, to grasp the present moment. One must first empty before being able to fill. The monk did not need to say anything. His mere presence was a silent invitation to observe this ceaseless movement, to watch the river without trying to control it, without trying to change it, just witnessing its flow. The traveler was beginning to realize, however timidly, that his thoughts were nothing more than passing events, not absolute truth, not definitive reality, the mere waves rising and dissipating in the vast ocean of consciousness. The daylight began to shift, casting long shadows over the mountain. The silence deepened, not as an absence of sound, but as an absolute presence. A presence that seeped through the cracks of his restless mind, bringing the first moments of stillness. A bird cut across the sky, a gentle breeze passed, and the traveler, for the first time in a long while, took a deep breath. The ancient fig tree bore silent witness to thousands of stories. Its deep roots sank into the earth like ancestral memories, while its branches stretched out like arms of wisdom, inviting beings to find refuge in its timeless shade. The monk sat in the lotus position. It was not a deliberate act, but a natural flow, like water finding its course. The traveler watched, at first with unease, then with a curiosity that reached beyond immediate understanding. There was no movement, no tension, only breath. A breath that was more than the mere intake and release of air. It was a profound connection between the inner and outer worlds. Each inhalation drew the universe inward. Each exhalation returned a transformed particle of consciousness to the cosmos. The traveler, accustomed to the frantic motion of his own mind, could not initially grasp this stillness. To him, stopping was synonymous with unproductivity, with stagnation. But there, before this unmoving figure, something within his carefully constructed certainties began to crumble. Meditation was not an escape, but an encounter. An encounter with oneself, with one's thoughts, with the deepest layers of existence. It was like diving into an inner ocean, where each depth revealed new mysteries, new understandings. The ancient masters had said that the true journey was not across external landscapes, but through the inner terrains of consciousness. And there, beneath the fig tree, this truth took shape and breath. Minutes stretched into eternity. Time lost its linear, fragmented nature. Only the present moment remained, pulsing in its absolute nakedness. The traveler's mind, at first a whirlwind of thoughts, began to settle. Like a restless lake that, when observed without judgment, gradually finds its smooth, reflective surface. Breath, observation, presence. 3 words that condensed centuries of contemplative wisdom, not as abstract concepts, but as a living experience embodied in that precise moment. The monk was no longer merely an individual sitting. He was consciousness itself, observing itself. There was no division between observer and observed, a state where the I dissolved into the vastness of being. Tradition tells that Siddhartha Gautama, beneath the Bodhi tree, attained enlightenment through deep meditation. And in that moment, the traveler began to experience the first glimpses of this radical understanding. It was not about seeking something external. It was not about reaching a special state. It was about recognizing what had always been there: peace, clarity, the pure awareness that pervades all existence. The fig tree continued its silent vigil, witness to countless seekers, to infinite inner journeys. Its branches swayed gently, as if whispering ancient secrets to those who could listen beyond sound. The traveler felt something dissolving within him. It was not tears. It was not emotion. It was something deeper. A realization beyond words. A dissolution of the boundaries he himself had built between his being and the universe. The light shifted. Shadows grew longer. And the meditation continued, not as an act, but as a state of being. The transformation had begun. The words the traveler carried were like rusted thorns. Each memory, each recollection, was wrapped in self-judgment, in biting criticism he directed at himself. There was no compassion in his inner dialogue, only one sentence after another, a continuous judgment consuming him from within. The monk remained silent, not an empty silence, but one pregnant with understanding. A silence that embraced without judgment, that listened without condemnation. When the traveler began pouring out his anguish, he expected either criticism or cheap consolation. But he found something entirely different, a kind of listening that did not fragment, that did not separate, that did not categorize his experiences as good or bad. His words were like passing clouds, some heavy with sadness, others with anger, some filled with deep fear. And the monk observed them drift by, just as one watches a landscape in constant transformation. "I have failed at everything," said the traveler. "I will never be good enough." Each word was a weight, each thought a chain binding him to a past that existed only in his mind. The judgments he passed on himself were more imprisoning than any external bars. The Zen tradition teaches that judgment creates a second layer of suffering over the original experience. If something happens that causes us pain, judgment multiplies that pain, creating a narrative that distances us from the pure experience itself. The monk knew that every human being carries a story made of successes and failures, of luminous and dark moments. But these stories do not define one's essence. They are merely waves passing over the vast ocean of consciousness. "Observe," the monk finally said, breaking the silence not with advice but with an invitation. Observe without condemning. It was a call to a state of awareness where thoughts are seen but not identified with, where emotions are felt but not consumed. A state of pure witnessing without the constant need to classify, judge, or condemn. The traveler began to realize that his judgments were like veils obstructing clear vision. Each criticism, each negative thought was a lens distorting reality, turning experiences into definitive sentences. Compassion was not something external to be sought, but an inner quality to be discovered, a capacity to look at oneself with the same kindness one would offer a wounded child. His eyes, once heavy with guilt, began to hold a different kind of lightness. It was not happiness. It was something deeper, an acceptance that did not mean agreement but recognition. The world around him remained unchanged. The mountain stood. The fig tree continued its deep-rooted stillness. And there, in that moment, the traveler experienced the first glimpses of a freedom that goes beyond words. Not judging did not mean not seeing. It meant seeing with clarity, without the heavy filters of judgment. Seeing one's own limits, one's own wounds, one's own challenges with the gaze of an observer, not that of a judge. The daylight began to shift. Shadows stretched longer, and something within the traveler began to dissolve. It was not tears. It was not sadness. It was something subtler, a realization beyond words. The journey continued. The storm approached like an invisible giant. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, carrying the promise of water, wind, and transformation. It was more than just a weather phenomenon. It was a living metaphor for the inner journey the traveler was undertaking. The monk watched the sky with the same serenity with which he observed his own thoughts. No sudden movements, no anticipation, just complete presence in the moment. When the first drops began to fall, he did not hesitate. Half of his robe was offered to the traveler. But the gesture was not merely for physical protection. It was an embodied teaching, a living lesson on detachment and transformation. "It is not to shield you from the weather," he said softly, "but to remind you that nothing is permanent." Each raindrop was a reminder. Each gust of wind, a metaphor. Water flowed, reshaping the landscape, dissolving boundaries, creating new paths in an instant. The traveler now understood that his greatest prisons were not external. They were built within his own mind, attachments to ideas, expectations, and narratives he had constructed about himself and the world. Buddhist tradition teaches that suffering arises from attachment, not just to material possessions, but to concepts, self-images, and rigid ideas about who we are or should be. Letting go does not mean destruction. It means allowing existence to flow. Just as the rain does not judge the ground it touches, but simply flows, the traveler began to realize that he could move through his own experiences without needing to condemn or glorify them. The shared robe was more than just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of connection, of compassion, of recognition of human vulnerability. In the simplicity of that gesture, there was a silent revolution. Personal transformation does not happen in grand, dramatic moments. It unfolds in small gestures, in subtle shifts of perception, in the moments when we choose to see differently. Every pore of the traveler's skin absorbed the lesson. The rain washed not just his body, but also old layers of resistance, fear, and self-condemnation. It was a silent baptism, an initiation without words. The monk remained still, not like a rigid statue, but like a river, flexible, present, in constant motion, unattached to any fixed form. "Look at the rain," he said. "It falls, it touches the earth, and then it moves on. It holds no resentment. It does not regret wetting one stone instead of another. It simply is." The metaphor was clear. Life happens. Experiences come and go. Pain, joy, success, failure. They are merely passing waves in the vast ocean of existence. The traveler felt something dissolving within him. It was not just the rainwater streaming down his body. It was a deeper kind of dissolution. His old thought patterns, his rigid defenses, his crystallized fears, everything was beginning to soften, to flow. The light filtered differently through the rain. The world felt more alive, more present. Each drop carried a story. Each gust of wind whispered an ancient secret about the nature of existence. "Letting go does not mean you do not care," the monk continued. "It means caring deeply without the need to control. It means loving without imprisoning. It means living fully in each moment without carrying the weight of those that have already passed." The storm began to fade, not abruptly, but like a gentle sigh. The sky started to clear, revealing shades of blue and gray dancing in delicate harmony. And the traveler, soaked yet transformed, continued his journey. The path narrowed between rocks and sparse vegetation. The late afternoon light painted the horizon in shades of amber and violet, creating a scene of farewell and reflection. Years of Zen tradition converged in that moment. The traveler realized he had never asked the monk's name, and the monk had never introduced himself. He then understood one of the deepest principles of Eastern wisdom. Names are merely labels, and essence lies far beyond words. Like two currents of the same river, they had shared a journey that transcended personal identification. They were no longer a monk and a traveler. They were simply consciousness meeting, experiencing, transforming. As they parted, there was no embrace, no traditional handshake, just a gaze. A gaze that contained universes, a gaze that communicated more than millennia of words ever could. The traveler continued on his path, transformed not by eloquent words or extraordinary techniques, but by the silence that now accompanied him. Each step felt different, each breath more conscious. True wisdom is not in what is spoken, but in what is understood in silence. It is not grand speeches that transform us, but moments of deep connection with ourselves. Learning to be present, to observe without judgment, to let go without resistance. This is the true path of self-knowledge. Our greatest battles take place within us, and our greatest victory is not in defeating something external, but in understanding our own nature. Silence is not absence. It is total presence. It is in silence that we discover who we truly are, beyond names, stories, and expectations. The most important journey we can take is the journey within ourselves. And that journey does not require many words. It requires only the courage to look, the compassion to accept, and the wisdom to transform.